So one of the things I'm going to talk about is try to go back in the past on how we actually took care of ourselves. And to a large extent, kind of lost our way as it relates to healthcare. You know, since the 1800s, we've always had family doctors, practitioners that pretty much looked at each other, our family members, et cetera, and intuitively grew a lot of knowledge in terms of what was the norm for the individual over their lifetime. In a large extent, what struck me, I remember I was in a small town that he actually used to take EKG measurements every time I had a checkup. How many people today get EKG measurements every time they go for a checkup? One person. So when we talk about digital data and everything else that we'll be talking about later, one would question, are we actually even collecting any data? But more importantly, are we collecting the information that's critical for the doctor to understand what is normal and what is abnormal for you as a person? And to me, what we're looking at since the 1800s, we've lost that formula of actual health care. And that's an area that we need to rethink. What was the methodology that we did in the 1800s that actually was successful? Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to promote that we go back to the 1800s and start bleeding people. But at the same time, imagine if we could somehow take the same methodology we did in the past, merge that with the technologies that we have today and moving forward to really change the whole way we look at our healthcare. It's interesting, in 1966, there's a report called the Miller's Commission, and I want you to focus on that paragraph, what it says. A physician who focuses on the individual organs and systems, but upon the whole man who lives a complex setting, knows that diagnosis and treatment of a part can significantly overlook the major causative factors and therapeutic opportunities. Since the 1950s, we've all become specialized in terms of I got to go to a kidney specialist, et cetera. But one of the challenges we have is we don't look at the human body as a holistic system. And that's the area that I think technology can really make a difference as we look forward. These are some of the major trends that are making it, in terms of headwinds, more and more difficult for us to provide effective health care. Families are more and more mobile. Even with medical records today, one of the speakers talked about garbage in, garbage out. That data is not coalesced, analyzed, and so on for a doctor, if I go from one part of the country to the other, to really be able to look at that data and understand what is going on with that individual. So that lack of cohesive medical records for continuity of care, no one's paying attention to that today. So even if we have big data doesn't solve that problem if it doesn't get digested in a way that can be easily comprehended. There's also severe shortages of practitioners that everybody's talking about. You'll notice I have a big bandage here. I live in Reno, Nevada. I had a small little skin cancer that I had to remove. I called up my doctor, and there was a 3 to 6 month waiting. I said, well, wait a minute, this could be something important. Well, fortunately, I had the means. I went to California. They looked at it, and they removed it. It is so bad in Reno with the shortages of care that a great majority of the family practitioners aren't even accepting any more new patients. So sometimes when we talk about shortages, we think of third world countries, we think of developing nations. This is happening in our own country. So with all the money we're spending, we're not really taking care of ourselves. Where's that money going? One would argue that, are we actually really looking at a proactive system versus a reactive? What's really strange in the way our system is set up today is we go by appointments rather than prioritizing who should be looked at first. So the whole thing is screwed up. So if I, in this case, had an urgent need, but there's a queue, what have we done to our system and how we prioritize our care? It's a fascinating quote here that you can read from Stanford. And in yellow it says, you're thinking about the mechanics of the documentation rather than the implications of the systems and the findings. He's talking about electronic medical records. So if I take that electronic medical records and I put that in a big data AI system, what's going to happen? The AI is no smarter than we are. It's going to say it's garbage because we haven't found a way to coalesce that information. What's worse is this poor family doctor, instead of actually looking and paying attention to the person and learning what their norm is completely preoccupied as a data clerk. There's a term called Modified Early Warning Score, or RONTM Index. How many people are familiar with that? Couple. It's a fascinating thing. Yale did a study back approximately, I think 10 years ago now, where they discovered that if they took the vital data of critical patients in an ER or in an old elderly home care facility, they discovered that if they would plot it, this was an MIT guy who lost his mother, got really frustrated that she shouldn't have died in his mind. And by the way, we're very dangerous as engineers. I have no medical training, but I think I've read 60,000 medical papers. But I have no medical education. I've been challenged about that for many years. But what I have been able to find out was that what they did here is the Yale study, is they actually just took data. The vital data was actually one of the most primary measurements they took, plus other information. And all they did was put a plot over a period of time, 3 months, and they kept on collecting this data. And then all they did was they asked the nurse practitioners and the doctors to look at the plots, and the ones that tended to trend downward, to prioritize their time to focus on their care first, without diagnosis, just trends. They were able to find that they saved a 30% mortality rate by doing this, without diagnosis. So I'm going to move fast because I only have 3 more minutes left. I went ahead of my schedule, I guess. But the whole point here is that we want to look at multi-sensor data fusion as a way to monitor our people. Our company has developed a sensor technology that one of the biggest challenges we have is how do you collect vital data without it being invasive? Because I can't put a 12-lead EKG system on a person and expect them to wear that 24 hours a day. And it's also, we've found that wearables, a lot of them, are not medical grade. We at our company, and you'd be happy to have further discussions with you at our booth, have invented a technology that collects medical grade data. It's called a seismocardiogram. With this little device right here, I can actually look at not only my respiratory and vital data, I know where the aorta's opening, all the mechanical valves, without any invasive technology, doesn't have to touch the skin, et cetera. So what this is all doing is we're trying to solve a major problem. How do we collect data in a way that's, number one, analytical, constructive, and we've also created a mathematical model of the actual cardiac signature to the point that I can identify every one of you based on your heart signature without new technology, just like a biometric device. So that mathematical model, we can tell now what your norm is and what is the actual trend so that we understand whether or not you're doing better or worse. And this is a presentation, a picture of our software we can share with you in a few moments if you want in the back. So finally, the fusion of technology and medicine is very powerful, but we need to make sure there's a way to collect and make this data and analysis that are actionable, that empower both the practitioner as well as the patients. Any questions?
How is your device primarily used? How is your device primarily used? Is it post-acute? Is it in-home prevention?
To be all the above. So when we first developed this, the intent was for people at home, especially the elderly or people with chronic disease. I mean, like today, I have a 93-year-old mother, and that 3 times a week they send a practitioner to measure all her vitals. You know, that's very costly and intrusive in their lives. So if there is we were trying to come up with a device that can do respiratory, pulmonary detection, all that, without even needing that practitioner to figure out where to put the electrical leads. Literally, you can just wear this like this. It can be put into a seat, and one could watch TV all day long and collect all the vitals. So that was the intent. But it could be used in ERs. It could be used in any type of environment.
Alas, we're from Reno.
Yes?
Yeah, we're from Reno. And I think, again, we have the Fitbit, we have our iPhones, we have the watches to measure, and it's getting to the point that I fear that consumers are just going to think they're all toys because they don't know what to do with the
Well, that's a very
data.
good point, because it's actually been dumbed down, I'll tell you the truth. We had to do clinical study with our device. And if you're familiar with clinical study, there's an IRB, Institutional Review Board. And we had to go through over a number of patients, as you can imagine, with the clinical study. And they were very specific to not call these Fitbits and stuffs EKGs. We got in trouble because we were using a 3-lead device, and they said that's not an EKG, that's a rhythm monitor, pulse monitor. So what that means is not diagnosable for traditional medical grade. And so what's important is not to dumb down technology to the point it becomes useless. We do not sell this at $100 a piece. This is a high-end system specifically designed for the medical industry to do diagnosis and be able to collect actionable data. And that's a good point, because it becomes a point where people think of it just being a dumb technology, and then we lose the value of it at the end of the day. Any other questions?
So, I mean, Gary Goldman, I'm actually an anesthesiologist in addition to a lot of other things. But when you look at digital devices and digital data and you're generating it, I mean, you bring up a very valid point to be able to separate the difference between commercial devices and medical grade devices. With your device, so in terms of your clinical studies, how have you compared them to a 12-lead EKG or to the traditional ways that we're actually using that data? And how sensitive and specific is it compared to what we're already using?
Yeah, that's an important point. We had to do that as part of the clinical studies to prove its precision based on reference predicate devices such as an EKG 12-lead device. And we did that with over hundreds of people. But what we discovered is it's very precise, but it's not the same. The seismocardiogram was invented in the 1940s. This is not a new idea. Very few cardiologists even know what a seismocardiogram is. But what's important is that there's a one-to-one correlation between a lot of the pulmonary measurements, whether it be heart rate variability, and in our case, we even do respiratory. What the value is of this is that we can collect this non-intrusively. We're not saying we replace an EKG, but once you find abnormalities, you can then take an EKG if you want to do further detailed diagnosis. As I said, only one person raised their hand when they said that they were monitored with an EKG. That's why we need additional help. Yeah.
Frank, thank you so much.